In the last 14 months, I have not seen one example of one mother who told his son or a daughter who was a doctor or a nurse that please stop going to the hospital, stop serving the COVID patients, because each one of us have seen, our family members have seen, all of us have seen our very dear and near close friends, relatives dying, not only because of COVID, but also dying because they were serving people, they were serving COVID patients, they were trying to protect and save the lives of others. So this contribution of all of you will certainly go down in history as one of the examples to be emulated and which would give inspiration to generations of our younger people in future. The medical students have seen today what the doctors have done, what the seniors have done, and I am sure that this is going to be written in or a daughter who was a doctor or a nurse that please stop going to the hospital, stop serving the COVID patients, because each one of us have seen, our family members have seen, all of us have seen our very dear and near close friends, relatives dying, not only because of COVID, but also dying because they were serving people, they were serving COVID patients, they were trying to protect and save the lives of others. So this contribution of all of you will certainly go down in history as one of the examples to be emulated and which would give inspiration to generations of our younger people in future. The medical students have seen today what the doctors have done, what the seniors have done, and I am sure that this is going to be written in golden letters in the history of the medical profession. And I always recall very fondly the year 1994 when I had the privilege of being the Health Minister of Delhi and also enjoyed the privilege of being the President of the Delhi Medical Association. And when I was blessed by God to dream
like to introduce the Director General, Dr. Tedros, for his welcoming remarks. DG, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tim. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all Member States, and thank you for joining us once again. As you know, Monday was International Women's Day. Globally, 59% of deaths from COVID-19 are among men, but women have suffered disproportionately in many other ways. We have seen appalling increases in violence against women and reduced access to services for sexual and reproductive health. Employment losses have been high, even as women have borne a disproportionate burden of care for children and older people. Women have been at the forefront of the response, making up about 70% of the health workforce globally. And yet, women only hold 25% of leadership roles in health. This week, I was also pleased to sign a memorandum of understanding with Women in Global Health to promote women in leadership in health. And in February, together with France and Women in Global Health, WHO launched the Gender Equal Health and Care Workforce Initiative to increase the proportion of women in leadership in health and care, to promote equal pay, to protect women in health and care from sexual harassment and violence at work, and to ensure safe and decent working conditions for women health and care workers, including access to personal protective equipment and vaccines against COVID-19. Earlier this week, WHO also published a new report that represents the largest study ever conducted on the prevalence of violence against women from 2000 to 2018. The report paints a shocking picture. An estimated 736 million women, almost 1 in 3 women globally, have suffered intimate partner violence, sexual violence from a non-partner, or both, at least once in their lives. But the report also highlights the many tools that Member States can use to prevent violence against women and provide quality care for survivors. To mark International Women's Day, WHO also launched a new global breast cancer initiative aimed at reducing mortality from breast cancer by 2.5% every year until 2040, saving 2.5 million lives. Breast cancer has overtaken lung cancer as the world's most diagnosed cancer. Survival 5 years after diagnosis now exceeds 80% in most high-income countries, but survival rates are much lower in lower-income countries. There is much we can do to save these women's lives. As you know, the rollout of vaccines through COVAX is continuing. We expect to deliver a total of 237 million vaccines between now and May. This is encouraging progress, but the volume of doses being distributed through COVAX is still relatively small. One of our main priorities now is to increase the ambition of COVAX to help all countries end the pandemic. This means urgent action to ramp up production. This week, WHO and our COVAX partners met with partners from governments and industry to identify bottlenecks in production and discuss how to address them. We see 4 ways to do this. The first and most short-term approach is to connect vaccine manufacturers with other companies who have excess capacity to fill and finish, to speed up production and increase volumes. The second is bilateral technology transfer through voluntary licensing from a company that owns the patents on a vaccine to another company who can produce them, as AstraZeneca has done with SK Bio in the Republic of Korea and the Serum Institute of India. The third approach is coordinated technology transfers through a global mechanism coordinated by WHO. This provides more transparency and a more coherent global approach that contributes to regional health security. And fourth, many countries with vaccine manufacturing capacities can start producing their own vaccines by waiving intellectual property rights as proposed by South Africa and India to the World Trade Organization. The TRIPS agreement was designed to allow for flexibility on intellectual property rights in the cases of emergencies. If now is not the time during unprecedented times to use those flexibilities, then when? Now to today's agenda. First, you will hear an update on the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response from Dr. Anders Nostrom. I would like to thank the co-chairs and the members of the panel and Anders and his team in the Secretariat for their diligent work so far. The panel has taken inputs from a broad array of stakeholders and is now finalizing its conclusions and recommendations. Anders will provide an update on the substantive work done so far and the next steps in the panel's work. You will also hear from Professor Lothar Wieler, Chair of the IHR Review Committee. I would like to thank the members of the committee for their hard work and Dr. Wieler for his leadership and dedication. The work of the IHR Review Committee is being coordinated with that of other ongoing assessments, namely the IPR and the Independent Oversight and Advisory Committee for the WHO Health Emergencies Program. Finally, we still hope to receive both the summary and full report of the WHO-led study on the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus next week. When the reports are ready, we will ask the expert team to share them with member states ahead of their release, and we're working on organizing a briefing for you. I have said many times that the world must learn lasting lessons from this pandemic, and there is growing global interest in the idea of a pandemic treaty. It's important to me that we ensure all member states are fully updated on the status of this exciting idea, and we will have a member state briefing on pandemic treaty next week. The details of this briefing will be sent out to you shortly. Excellencies, as always, we're grateful for your support, and we look forward to your questions and comments. I thank you. Tim, back to you.
Thank you very much, DG. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anders Nordstrom, Head of the Secretariat for the COVID-19 Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. Anders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim and Dr. Tedros. On the behalf of the co-chairs of the independent panel, it's a pleasure for me to provide an update of the work of the independent panel. It's now almost a year ago since the World Health Assembly passed a resolution requesting the Director General to initiate an impartial, independent and comprehensive evaluation of the international health response as coordinated by WHO. It's 6 months since the panel met first time, which was in September last year. So there's been a lot of work and intense consultations and inputs from many stakeholders during those 6 months. Now the panel is meeting for the 5th time next week, and then they have one final meeting scheduled then for April. The ambition is that the report will be ready the week of the 10th of May, meaning in roughly 2 months' time from now. What I would like to do now is to provide an update to you in terms of what has been covered and what are now the next steps in terms of then drawing some conclusions and coming up with some recommendations that hopefully will be helpful to you as member states. So I briefed you before about that the panel has been following a program of work with 4 themes and 9 specific areas of work. And I will say a couple of words about those in terms of what the panel has been able to accomplish this far. The first one was to look back, to see what has happened in the past, to look back at previous commissions, panels, but also just to see what is different with this pandemic compared to previous pandemics. And there is a separate background paper that will be published on this, drawing some conclusions and reflection in terms of what can we learn by looking back and what was different this time. Second is that the panel has been doing a detailed chronology in terms of what happened at the initial phase of the outbreak, both in terms of when cases were reported, when new science were published, when technical guidelines were issued, and how different countries across the world then reacted to this. And this will also be published as part or as an annex to the panel's report that you can make. Next part has been to understand and to review how technical guidelines has been developed. The machinery behind that, the very impressive work by WHO, reviewing science, coming up with guidelines, revising guidelines, but more importantly, perhaps even, with all due respect for WHO, is then how those guidelines were actually implemented by different partners, governments, but also other partners. So there is one piece of work that we are still not concluded on, but working on right now. The next one is quite a big piece of work that the panel has been doing. That is to try to understand national response. So 28 country studies with 6 more deep dives to try to understand how did country respond when it comes to leadership coordination, implementing public health measures, understanding capacities, understanding also community responses, and a wide range of issues. 28 countries, they were chosen based on the situation on this 5th of October last year. The 7 worst affected countries, the 7 least affected countries, and then 14 countries in the middle to get a good range of countries. The report is focusing on best practices, what were good practices that one can learn from and build on for the future. The report is not finalized yet. There will be a technical expert hearing, meeting, discussion about the initial findings slightly later on this month. But there is a lot of very interesting data coming out from this in terms of what de facto happened in countries, what did countries de facto do. We have also looked at the impact in different ways of this pandemic, the impact of non-COVID health services, looked at what happened to immunization, routine immunizations, RMCH, malaria, TB, but also when it comes to NCDs, also in high-income countries, and try to understand the impact of this, but also what mitigation strategies were put in place by countries, and to see whether we can say something about the impact of those mitigation strategies. The second one was to look at how health systems cope with access to essential supplies and try to understand what countries did, capacities, but also how the international system were able then to support countries where there was a need. And the third one, which has been very much discussed, and it will be continued to be discussed here today, to understand not the details, but the broader ecosystem behind the Act A, how the international system was able to move from knowledge, needs, research, to production, to access, and to financing, that ecosystem, to see whether there is something that the panel potentially can say in terms of recommendations for the future. Not at the details, but more at a high-level ecosystem for this. Then the panel has looked at, or is still looking at, issues around communication and communities. What impact, or how was it different this time with information being immediately available to people across the world? What did that mean in terms of people's access to information, but also in terms of people's anxiety, and how this triggered them quite a different situation this time than what we have had or seen in the past. Same thing for communities. How did communities actually manage, cope, and what were positive factors? We have done a number of case studies here to understand when communities were respected, empowered, in what way did that help actually to coping, not just with managing, of course, the spread of the virus, but actually surviving. And then finally, in terms of the impact, we have done 2 summary studies with 2 researchers to understand the economic impact and the broader social impact on people. So one looking at the economic dimensions, then summarizing basically published data from IMF, from the World Bank, UNDP, etc. And then another study looking at the social cost and social impact in terms of education, etc. For both of those also, not just trying to map out what has been the cost, but also what has been underlying structural factors that have either had a positive or negative impact on those 2 dimensions. Now we skip one. Interesting. There should have been a slide about WHO here in the middle. So what we have done in terms of also looking at the international system and WHO specifically is to take a slightly broader look at WHO. So we have conducted a number of interviews asking more questions of institutional nature. The role and mandate of WHO. What should be the role and mandate of WHO in a situation of pandemic for preparedness or for response? Other things that WHO should not be doing. What is the authority and the mandate of WHO and ultimately the Director General? Is the financing of WHO good enough? Is the organization capacity good enough? And is the governance good enough? And there will be some conclusions and reflection on that. So where we are right now is then to bring all of this together, analyzing the facts, the data, what we heard through or seen through desk reviews, interviews, and technical roundtables. And then now working on what we call priority areas for recommendations. Areas where potentially the panel can come up with recommendations that should have an impact, that should have a distinct value, that this panel can actually say something distinct from other processes that are ongoing, and also then, of course, recognizing the gravity of the present moment. Now, this coming panel meeting, the panel will discuss then not final recommendation because they are still not there, but rather than options, and then check those again with criteria to see what impact the feasibility and the timeline that are associated with different potential recommendations. So we're doing this in a systematic way. We're looking at the different phases of preparedness, detection, alert, early response, and this sustained or the continued response. We're looking at different functions, leadership, coordination, access to resources, access to data, knowledge, communication, accountability, and compliance. Looking at WHO, looking at the international system at large, but also then bringing in what we've heard from countries through interviews and the studies of the national responses. And then hopefully this ends my presentation or briefing. Hopefully the panel will then be able to come up, and they're very clear that they would like not to make general recommendations. They would like to make some very distinct recommendations to say that if this is done by this either body or political sort of setting, that would have the impact making our situation better next time. And the panel has the privilege, of course, to look back. The panel is not about blaming things that were not done potentially in the most optimal way, but looking forward and trying to come up with recommendations that will hopefully help the world to be able to manage even better next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders, for that presentation. I understand that Professor Wheeler from the IHR Review Committee is online? In 2 minutes. Thank you. Excuse me for that. If I may then, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, beg your indulgence for 2 minutes whilst we wait for Professor Wheeler to come online. However, I would suggest that if there is any pertinent question for Dr. Nordstrom, we could take any question on the IPPPR presentation whilst we wait for Professor Wheeler to come online. Jude, is there any flags up? I'd like to introduce Jude Osai, who will be moderating this session today. Over to you, Jude.
slides up yet. No request from the floor, that is. We're just waiting for Professor Wheeler to come on mic, hopefully in the next few minutes.
Thank you, Jude. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I would beg your indulgence for a minute or so whilst we get the chair of the review committee of the IHR online. Thank you for your patience. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Lothar Wheeler, Chair of the Review Committee. Professor Wheeler, you have the floor.
Professor Wheeler, could you kindly unmute, please? Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed, sir.
Oh, I have the floor. Good afternoon, good evening to Her Excellencies and friends, colleagues. I'm sorry, I thought I would be online at 1 o'clock, but that's fine. So if the secretariat please pulls up the slides, and I will give you an overview of the work that we've been done over the last, is it 6 months already? I don't know, since September. How did we proceed? What have we done over the last, since the 8th of September? So we have, oops, now the slides are gone. We have formed 3 subgroups, basically on the deliberations of the pandemic fight, its alert, its preparedness, and its response. So these are 3 different areas which are, of course, very important when it comes to containing and preparing against the pandemic. We had a total of 23 closed virtual meetings. Each of them was actually virtual, which was not easy in the beginning. And 6 open meetings with member states and stakeholders. In addition, the subgroups are meeting weekly, and these are the 3 ones that I mentioned. And in addition, since roughly 4 weeks, I think we have a so-called governance and writing subgroup, so that we don't oversee, that we don't miss any particular topic and have an overview of this. What we are particular based on is evidence. So we really want to have as much as possible evidence before we file any recommendations. What did we do? Of course, our mandate is to review the function of the IHR during COVID-19. This is our mandate. We are an independent group of scientists. And what did we do? We interviewed various stakeholders, the chairs of all previous emergency committees, of all previous IHR review committees, WHO regional directors, several ones regional emergency directors, national focal points of various countries, because obviously these are very important when it comes to communication, timely communication, and communication which is very much needed for risk assessment, of course. You see all the countries listed here, WHO country office representatives, legal counsel, and so on and so on. So various stakeholders' expertise, which was very intensive, very clear, and very helpful. Particular to understand the different issues here. And also we had interviews with partners from other organizations, as mentioned here, the IOHCR, ICAO, IATA, IMO, IOM, and GORN. Also, we reviewed submissions from member states as they are listed here. And I'd like to address my thanks to the member states for giving us the opportunity to openly and transparently communicate with you, because I can only echo this because the IHR is your legal document, and you, the member states, are those who make IHR a living document, and the implementation is fully in the hands of the member states. The next slide, please. So we filed an interim progress, the document EB148. Overall, we assessed that there is in the member state an overwhelming support for the regulations, which is very important and fully appreciated and understood. But there need to be improvements in various areas. And these improvements are basically, they should be mandatory, because these are the key issues to have a better prepared world for the next pandemic, which I'm sorry to say, which may come even during our lifetime. We don't know it, but it's possible, sure, and we have to be prepared for it. So preparedness, we are looking, investigating particularly IHR core capacities, assessment, monitoring, reporting. Here we also looked a lot at tools, and digitization clearly is a recommendation, that there will be recommendation regarding digitization. Alert, the notification outbreak alert mechanism, again, digitization is of importance here. Risk assessment, which is very, very, very important. And it's not only important for the particular country that is notifying, but it's particularly important if it comes to the field recovery. It's only as good as the information provided by member states. That's for sure, and that's clear. Response, travel is an issue. Yeah, absolutely. To say this, the IHR basically tries not to hinder travel and trade, because it says there shouldn't be unnecessary interventions with travel and trade. However, as we have seen during this pandemic, travel interventions, particularly early on, are efficient. And so the unnecessary term, the term unnecessary, needs to be very, very strongly discussed and looked at. So, and again, communication, information sharing. I leave this slide with one general statement. It is all about trust. Yeah? And you can only build up trust in an interpandemic time span. So trust has to be built up by communicating with people, building up trust, meeting, discussing problems, discussing issues, discussing regular rules, and this is something that I think is of utmost importance. Next slide, please. Yeah, because technical issues are important, but if you don't use the technology appropriately, what can you do with it? Was requested to conduct a study in consultation with member states on the need for and potential benefits of, and as appropriate, make proposals to the 74th Health Assemblies through the Executive Board on possible complementary mechanisms to be used by the Director General to alert the global community about the severity and the magnitude of a public health emergency in order to mobilize necessary support and to facilitate international coordination. And this further informed the deliberation of the committee, and we identified potential benefits and drawbacks of an issue that has been raised by previous research review committee already, the possibility of an intermediate level of alert for the FEAG. If you go to the next slide, please. So we basically presented this in an open meeting here because we think it is very important that we discuss this with the member states before the final recommendations are released. The better you understand our thinking, the better I think it is for the whole process. So, and we just filed pros and cons of this concept. Pros are left, cons are right. So the pros could be, it could raise awareness and trigger the need for preparedness. It could allow for better calibration, timeliness, proportionality, regionality, flexibility in response measures. It may allow for progressive, staggered and adequate preparation, which is then, in an ideal world, proportional to the level of risk. And it may encourage countries to promptly communicate in order to prevent the worsening of a situation. It could also encourage transparency, and countries would not feel threatened by perceived negative consequences due to the potential of restrictions which are linked to the FEIC. And possible resources could be mobilized according to the seriousness of the situation. This would be the ideal outcome if an intermediate FEIC would be feasible and would get into optimal implementation. On the right side now I move to the putative negative sides. So there is no clarity in the IHR or other mechanisms how to determine an intermediate level. How should it be made? So all the criteria and processes have to be established, and the emergency committee and the Director General have to basically be involved in this. No clarity currently on how WHO actions triggered by such determination would differ from the usual advice provided by WHO when communicating about public health events via the disease outbreak news. So basically, the risk assessment is the basic principle, and I think, or we are very convinced that the risk assessment is of utmost importance. Totally, whatever kind of FEIC, intermediate or whole FEIC you have, risk assessment is very important. This is based on information. It's, to our opinion, not useful if the purpose is only to alert people, because it requires clearly delineated response measures, resources, and transparent sharing of information between WHO and states, member states, because we need proper risk assessment. I mentioned this already. And to be frank here, still during this FEIC, this proper information is very important. This is big. From other more pressing issues that potentially have a much greater impact, such as clarity and compliance with recommendations by WHO, overall the implementation of the IHR. And also there's a risk of improper use of the intermediate grade or possible misunderstandings in attributing the right grade of alert. It requires again clear guidance from WHO. Clearly it's making things, or it could make things more complicated, which does not, of course, make it easier to communicate. And also arbitrary indicators could undermine the powerful normative statement of the FEIC. And there's a risk of improper use of the intermediate grade or possible misunderstandings in attributing the right grade of alert. Sorry, I had this already. It also would further complicate the assessment of an event and its monitoring, which is already complex when you're using the algorithm in Annex 2 of the IHR. Also, it could be misleading if an event still requires global attention, although it is not yet severe or not address the broader challenges, non-compliance, pressure not to declare, and so on. So this is our pros and cons regarding the concept of an intermediate FEIC. The next slide, please. So therefore, WHO should clarify the consequences of FEIC. We think that communication is here at the bottom of the challenge with the FEIC, as well as links with pandemic characterization. WHO, and these are possible recommendations, I want to say, yeah? These are not defined, but possible recommendations. And WHO should define clear criteria and processes for the communication of risk assessments for events WHO is assessing and related implications in terms of action. So there needs to be more clarification. This is our understanding of this issue. And the clarity in the provision of the IHR, including on the role and function of the emergency committee, is also needed. So these are possible recommendations. The next slide. And they are based on the evidence. Four different areas: core capacity requirements, IHR notification, national IHR focal points, and IHR legal preparedness. I have to say at this point that the fourth issue has so far not been touched by previous review committees, while the others, of course, have all been touched, and various of these recommendations have just been taken up by the member states. The next slide, please. So, possible recommendations for core capacity requirement. Governments must provide the required financial support for the implementation of the national action plans to strengthen core capacities at a national and subnational level. State parties should consider the opportunities of independent expert or peer review processes for engaging stakeholders beyond the health sector to identify and address country-level gaps in preparedness. WHO should review and strengthen the tools and processes of the IHR M&E, taking into consideration lessons learned from the current pandemic. And given the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for intersectoral collaboration, and this is the key issue here, the intersectoral collaboration, further develop guidance on how to structure rigorous, all-inclusive whole-of-government assessments and other preparedness activities. And WHO should support improved national implementation of IHR when needed, ensuring that each SP has identified and communicated the competent, responsible authority under IHR. So it's clearly a fact that we found and had previous review committees seen that this whole of government approach needs to be strengthened. So to understand how important the IHR is actually for the whole country and not only for the health sector. The next slide, please, addresses some possible recommendations regarding IHR notification and the alert system. WHO needs to monitor and document countries complying with the requirements for information sharing and publish quarterly or biannually a report with each country's performance without naming and blaming. This is, of course, a key prerequisite. States parties should communicate more proactively through the event information site with other states, parties and secretariat simultaneously. State parties should share the fullest possible public health information needed by WHO to assess the notified or verified event as soon as it becomes available. This may include, but not be limited to transmission patterns, incubation period, clinical features, genome sequence data, biological materials, and WHO should specifically ask for this information under the obligation of the IHR. WHO should establish a joint federated database model with interfaces for all countries to enable flexible and automated sharing of the information needed by WHO. The Director General should provide proposals for the World Health Assembly's consideration in relation to sharing public health information by the states parties under Article 6.2 in the light of evolving technology, there it is again, digitization, and the increasing importance of genome sequence data for risk assessment. This sequence data gives a lot of information, not only on the existence and identification of a pathogen, but also on its virulence as well as on its relationship. And you can draw really a lot of information out of when it comes to the source of an outbreak, for example. And WHO should proactively and assertively make use of the provisions of Article 11, IHR Article 11, to share information about public health risk with states parties. Next slide addresses the possible recommendations in the field of the national focal points. And this is, I think this is obvious to each of you who is listening to this, because this has been addressed various times. States parties should ensure the appropriate organization and positioning of the national focal points as being part of the authority of the government, not of one ministry only, and not let it not be only one person that doesn't have full access to the whole government. National focal points should be empowered, duly authorized and legally established with statutory rights to perform their functions institutionalized. WHO should establish a national focal point certification process with appropriate criteria and transparency evaluating the functioning and the outcome. A clear legal and governmental mandate. This is really important. And that's an important factor to ensure that the National Focal Point Authority to carry out their functions. We think that national legislation is a key issue here. And the competent authorities need to be more recognized and held to account for the functionality of the NFP and the delivery of other IHR obligations. Also, WHO should develop an accountability framework for the authorities responsible for implementing the IHR. And WHO should report to the governing bodies the level of countries' compliance as an incentive for governments to fulfill their IHR obligations. And the last topic here are the legal groundings. Next slide, please. This is the fourth area, the legal preparedness, and again, some possible, these are not the final, but only possible recommendations. States parties should ensure that national legal frameworks cover, among others, the protection of human rights and vulnerable groups, the establishment of a multi-sectoral mechanism, data collection, necessary data sharing across sectors and government levels, the establishment of the national IHR focal point and responsible authorities, quarantine and travel measures, among others. Now, we mentioned this particular as there are some countries, for example, that don't have the legal foundation to implement quarantine, for example, which of course is auch die next, please. So these are the next steps. As I mentioned already, March 30 is the live. Need your insights. So, the 5 weeks our work is done, and the Secretariat will send the final report for clearance and processing for the World Health Assembly in May 2021. And with this, I think no, the next slide, please, is very important. The next slide, I'd like to, not close this slide. So this is my thanks to all the members of the review committee, which have done a fantastic job, a very, very supportive, fantastic group. I'd like to thank particularly, of course, the Vice Chair, Lucille from Southern Africa, and Preben from Norway, and all the others that I mentioned here, the leads of the subgroups, Mark Salter, Jean-Marie Otto-Bele, and James Leduc, and of course not to forget the excellent support by the HR Secretariat of WHO. It has been a tough, intensive time over the last 6 months, but we all appreciate all the support, and we are looking forward to the day when many of the recommendations will be taken up by the Member States. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Wheeler, for that very comprehensive presentation. Now, I'd like to return to Member States. You have an opportunity for any questions or comments to Professor Wheeler or, of course, to Dr. Nordstrom from the IPPPR. Jude, over to you for the moderation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I recognize the State of Palestine. You have the floor, please. Palestine.
For their presentations. I have a question for the first speaker on IPPR. You have mentioned, sir, that conducting the studies on socio-economic impact, you've mentioned that there was collaboration with the IMF, the World Bank, and academia. Is there any collaboration with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the specialized agency on this issue, the UNCTAD? I thank you.
Thank you very much. Palestine, I recognize the European Union delegation. You have the floor, please.
That we are listening, we are hearing what you're saying. The points you're making are very timely and very relevant. As you know, the Member States are currently negotiating a resolution pursuant to decision EB 148-2, where we are also obliged to take into account the recommendations of the committees. I find these recommendations very useful. It would be good in terms of our work, because you need to take deep dives in your work, but sometimes so do we. But it would be good if we could have already also on 15 April a copy to the Member States without necessarily waiting for it to be translated into all the languages. And a question for Professor Wheeler specifically. A lot of the recommendations you made there in relation to focal points, can you confirm that they can be done without opening the IHR? Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, European Union. I recognize Ukraine, to be followed by Australia. Ukraine, you have the floor, please.
For very comprehensive and very interesting presentations. Just a small question, also specifically to Ms. Professor Wheeler, concerning the recommendation that you, possible recommendation to the IHR legal preparedness. And just interesting concerning, you mentioned about WHO should develop tools for the implementation of international norms in national legislation. Just maybe could you a little bit elaborate what type of tools and about what international norms are you considering? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ukraine. May I now give the floor to Australia, to be followed by UK. Australia, you have the floor, please.
Perhaps it preempts the discussion for next week's COVID weekly member state briefing. I note that a great deal of the debate now currently is focused on the prospect of the pandemic treaty. Just noting the sequencing of the reports and this discussion and the potential vehicle through which a treaty might be negotiated and eventuate. Could you comment on whether the reports or preliminary findings might speak to the prospect of pandemic treaty, and if so, how would you see the recommendations informing the development and potential implementation of the treaty? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Australia. May I invite the UK to be followed by the Russian Federation. The UK, you have the floor, please.
Thank you to the presenters for really insightful and interesting presentations. And really welcome this briefing. My question is that increasingly it seems to me that the independence of WHO and the ability of WHO to act independently of its member states at times is at the crux of some of the challenges that we're facing. It feels like we're perhaps as member states locked in a bit of a contradiction in that we're sometimes asking WHO and or its committees or groups that it establishes to act on the basis of evidence independently from member states, yet at the same time WHO is clearly a member state-led organisation and entirely dependent on member states access to data, often, for example, in outbreak areas. I wondered if the IPPPR or the IHR Review Committee would be commenting on that interface, that kind of sensitive interface between WHO, its member states, the influence that member states have over WHO in some of these areas, because I think it's a really important area, and I think we've touched on it already a little in the WHO strengthening resolution negotiations. And I would just like to second the points made by Australia on the treaty. Really interested in that and any views on that. So thanks very much.
now invite Russian Federation to be followed by Japan. Russian Federation, you have the floor, please.
Yes, we can. Please proceed.
For their presentations. It's really timely and the time pressure for the World Health Assembly. Every piece of information is very important. I would like to echo a question from EU with regards to which recommendations will require the opening of IHR. EU asks specifically for national focal points. My question to Dr. Willer, are you going to specify or split all the recommendations on those who require the opening IHR and those that do not? That's the first. And the second, with regards to finalization of the recommendations. If I'm right, you said that on the 3rd of March will be the last chance to contribute to the development of recommendations. And then April 13 is the last time for comments. So that means twice to contribute on March 30th and April 13 or only one time. And the second part of the question is there a chance to contribute to the language of the recommendations in case there are some critical comments? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russian Federation. I shall now invite Japan. You have the floor, please.
Thank you. So can you hear me?
Yeah, can.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this very informative and extremely helpful briefing, Dr. Nordstrom and Dr. Wheeler. And so, regarding the recommendations from IPPR and IHR, we are really interested in the recommendations themselves, but also we are really interested in what will take place after the recommendations will be issued. And so, regarding, I think, IHR, the discussion regarding IHR might be partly dependent upon the discussion among state parties. But regarding IPPR, we are wondering how the panel think about the follow-up of recommendations after the issuance of recommendations. So could you let me know whether the panel have any idea about the follow-up of recommendation, or whether think of including some recommendation regarding how to follow up IPPR's recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Japan. Chair, I have no further remarks.
thanks for those questions and comments. I would like to now firstly invite Dr. Anders Nordstrom to respond to the questions directed to you. Thanks, Anders.
No, thank you very much for very useful questions and feedback. On the question from Palestine, if I understood right, you were referring to UNCTAD. The answer is no. We have had no consultations directly with UNCTAD. We have had two roundtables, technical roundtables around the social economic consequences, both with regional entities and organizations like the Economic Commission for Africa, OECD, etc., with researchers and national partners, and then one or at the global level with the global stakeholders, but not at this part. On the issue about the treaty, the panel is looking at that as an issue to see whether there is a need for something complementary to IHR. There are no conclusions. They are working on the conclusions right now. But we have done quite a thorough study, not on the details of IHR, because that's the review committee's work to do, but rather to understand the environment or what is out there today in terms of other conventions and treaties. What are the functions of those? We have looked at the climate architecture for the climate convention to see what that might have to offer. So we have quite a thorough background paper on this, but I don't know where the panel is going to land. They are discussing it as one option to strengthen the international response. In terms of the question from the UK, in terms of the balancing between the independence in the integrity of WHO, but also member states actually taking responsibility. Yes, that is very much indeed discussed. And the balancing of having an effective governance, where governing body takes responsibility, on the same time giving full authority to the Director General then ultimately to be independent and to be able to tell the world what the situation is. So that is very much discussed, and they are thinking about what can one do to strengthen both the independence and the integrity of the organization and also the effective governance. But these needs to go hand in hand and needs to be able to come together. Also recognizing that WHO has functions that are of political nature. WHO is about member states coming together and providing the platform to be the convener for political discussion. So it's not that WHO should be free of political work, but WHO have different functions, and that is one. Complementary to the technical and operational ones. In terms of Japan's question about whether the panel is thinking anything about the future, no. It's the simple answer. The panel will make recommendations and make clear in terms of who they are directed to and what could be potential timelines or time schedule for the implementation. Then it's, of course, the panel is independent. They're they are making, their products will be something that member states need to reflect on, to think about, to see whether this is useful then for political decisions. But it might be that the panel should think another time in terms of then more, in terms of the follow-up, but presently they are not thinking about any specific suggestions on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. Now I'd like to return the floor to Professor Wheeler for responses to the questions and comments directed at yourself. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you for Nolan regarding the NFP. But we will go into this in more detail, of course, in the last 4 weeks of our discussions. The question about tools for legal framework, we didn't dive into this too much, but a possible area is that particular parts of legal issues from certain countries are basically set in a platform to see what and this, to my understanding, could be just, for example, sentences, some could be useful, but we didn't dive into this also too much. How they would this would be fulfilled. The colleague from Jose Aljacio asked about the recommendations about an international treaty. I can only echo here what Anders said. Yes, I think that this can be a complementary treaty, and I think last time I mentioned the fact that the IHR doesn't have teeth, and this is in particular when it comes to the response area. And this is clearly an area where we could foresee that an international treaty could foster the response part. So this is, yes, it's a possibility that we file this recommendation. The question was WHO and member states. I can echo what Anders said regarding the article, the question about the question from Russia about the dates. So I think this is a technical question that I would like to give to the IHR Secretariat. What I meant is intervention from the member state, but this should be clarified by the IHRC. And I think this is basically the question that I received, and I hope you are happy with my answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wheeler, for your response on that, and thank you, Dr. Nordstrom-Anders, for your presentation earlier today. With that, colleagues, we will close that first agenda item for this morning, for this afternoon, I'm sorry, or for most of us this afternoon, and now move on to the second part of today's discussion, and that's an update on the ACT Accelerator and COVAX. My pleasure to now introduce Dr. Bruce Aylward, Senior Advisor to the Director General. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Tim. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to Excellency Member States. If we could have the next slide, please. Do we have a ticker, Tim? So today we'll update you on three items. I'll run through the update, and then we have a couple of others who can help address questions, but we figured there'd be less time today, given we wanted to spend a lot of time on the IPPPR as well as the IHR review. But I'll walk you through with a few slides the release of the ACT Accelerator strategy and budget, which will be coming out tomorrow, and we'll make sure that that's circulated to all member states, but we want you to have the view on it following the comments that we received from so many of you over the recent weeks. Then we'll say a few words about some of the upcoming events to be aware of and for member state participation, and then finally update you on where we are with the COVAX rollout and some of the risks we face going forward. Next slide, please. Oops. So this is the cover of the new document. We've presented a little bit about it to you in previous meetings, but basically it's an update on the strategy, direction, priorities of the ACT Accelerator, recognizing the world is changing rapidly, the outbreak is evolving all the time, and even the virus is. So, of course, the new strategy reflects these changes. You'll receive it tonight or tomorrow morning, but you will see from this slide that there's sharper and new strategic integrated priorities across all the pillars. There's a sequencing of the priorities as asked for by some of our member states, the updated financing needs, the historical achievements, and then the financing framework and accountabilities going forward. Also, we spent a lot of time ensuring that this is fully aligned, of course, with the WHO SPRP, CEPI investment case, and other ACT-A agency plans. So you have, these are now fully aligned. With the next slide, I just want to say one or two points to remind you. I can move forward. Again, sure. Oopsie, sorry, let me just bring all of these up. Good. if we could have a hand just moving the slides forward. And once more. So there's 4 strategic priorities that in the new plan, as we've talked about previously. The first focus, of course, as you've reinforced the member states multiple times, rapid scale-up and delivery of the vaccine doses. The second strategic priority about bolstering the R&D, evaluation, regulatory paths to be able to address variants and optimize products going forward. And then the work to stimulate the uptake and ensure a robust pipeline of the most essential pieces, as Mike emphasizes all the time, the tests, the therapeutics, and the PPE, and especially the area of therapeutics, oxygen, medical oxygen, and dexamethasone. All of these are underpinned with pillars specific priorities. I've highlighted a couple in red. I won't go through these, but they relate to the new targets that each of the pillars are promoting going forward. And under the Health Systems Connector now, a much closer working relationship and integration with the work of the response itself. As well as linkages to the broader health systems agenda. So all of this is detailed in the new document. The next slide is the last one I wanted to just orient you to on this specific item. And what you see here is just the contributions to date, another very important part of the document, as well as the financing gap by pillar going forward. So that's just a quick overview of some of the content of the new strategic plan and budget for 2021. Will be released tonight, and then we will get that out to you, our member states, either late tonight or tomorrow morning. The next slide, please. With that, I'd like to just transition to a couple of upcoming events to be aware of that will now follow on from the development of the new plan. Next slide, please. First and most important of these, of course, is the 5th meeting of the ACT Accelerator Facilitation Council. This will be on the 23rd of March from 2:30 to 3 p.m., as you see here, Geneva time. The agenda will focus on 2 big issues. First, how we achieve the what are now very ambitious targets for diagnostics and therapeutics in 2021, and then also how we scale up production capacity for vaccine supply into COVAX. This is going to be a live streamed open meeting. There's a link at the bottom to how you can access it, which will also be on the ACT Accelerator site. In advance of the council meeting, if I could have the next slide, please. There will be a technical pre-briefing. We've had a lot of briefings on COVAX and on the vaccines. We've been asked by the co-chairs to have a pre-briefing on the diagnostics and therapeutics areas, the current state of play, next steps. And they've asked also that that be open to all member states and permanent missions. So you see here the date of next Friday for that. It will be held from 12:30 to 2 p.m. And you can register, you'll need to register just to make sure that we can link you into the pre-briefing, and there's a link at the bottom of the page there. We'll also get that out to you. The last thing we'd like to do from the perspective of the accelerator is to update you on the rollout of COVAX vaccines. Last week we emphasized the success to date with this first wave of deliveries that kicked off on the 24th of February. It has continued since then. If I could have the next slide, please. With now nearly, as the Director General said, 30 million COVAX doses have been delivered to 36 countries in just 2 weeks. So the rollout, while still we recognize is frustrating for some because the vaccines have yet to arrive. It is starting to move at a pace. With the next slide, we're often asked now, what is the status? If we could go back one. There we go. The status of vaccination. And I wanted to just alert you to the fact that now on the WHO vaccine, WHO COVID-19 dashboard, there is now a tab. I put a little red arrow on the left-hand side of the diagram there, which you can click on, and you can now get views for deaths and also status globally. And so this is a new feature on the dashboard. Thank you to member states for making the data available. You can see as well with the second red arrow that you have a rolling tally of the number of vaccine doses administered. And this is data from our member states, from your member states. There's sometimes a bit of a lag with some of the publicly available data as we're just starting to get this up and running now. The good news, of course, when you look at the detail of that map, is that we have an increasing number of countries on the African subcontinent, in the Middle East, in the Far East, etc., that are now vaccinating and beginning to change color. But as they do, there are still substantial white areas, which represent countries that have yet to start vaccinating, unfortunately, as well as a profound difference in the color of the green on those maps, which represents, of course, a continued inequity in the number of doses that are actually going to these countries. We are now over 300 million doses of vaccine distributed globally, but only a fraction of that still to LICs and lower middle-income countries. The next slide just shows you graphically some of the features of the rollout of the COVAX to date. You can see on the left-hand side, this shows the number of COVAX deliveries or shipments by date as of today. The darker bars confirmed and already taken place. The lighter colored bars on the left-hand side show you the planned deliveries. You will note that most of the columns are in orange, which represents shipments out of the Serum Institute of India, which has been one of the main suppliers, of course, with the AstraZeneca and Pfizer at a much lower rate, let's say, of shipments and volumes. On the right-hand side, you can see the volumes of doses that have been distributed by COVAX and also by supplier. So on that graphic, the light gray at the very top represents AstraZeneca doses. The orange color in the middle represents doses that have been distributed from the Serum Institute of India. It's the AstraZeneca vaccine, but through that facility. And then on the very bottom, you can see that darkest line, the relatively small number of doses still that have been distributed through Pfizer. What this represents, of course, or illustrates, is the huge importance of the SII, the Serum Institute of India, as a supplier to COVAX in terms of volumes. However, the AstraZeneca, equally important because of the large geographic territory served from that producer, the AstraZeneca SK Bio producer in Korea. If I could have the next slide, please. What this slide illustrates, and we'll try and make this a standard feature for you in the future, is the status of vaccines rollout globally. So what you're seeing here is not who has actually started vaccinating, but who has actually received vaccine and will start to vaccinate in the coming days. Because the difference between this slide and the previous one that you saw on the WHO dashboard, here we have a number of additional countries that are now colored and colored in yellow because they've received vaccine. Will need a couple of days to start vaccinating. The dark blue represents countries that started to vaccinate with bilateral doses or donations. The yellow, by the way, are countries that have received COVAX doses, they may also have bilateral deals or doses, but these represent where we ship to geographically so far. We expect a number of those gray areas will change color in the coming days. The last set of resources I wanted you to be aware of, and we're going to share the links, are the UNICEF dashboard, which you see on the left-hand side, where you can check and see the planned shipments for the coming week to 8 days. This changes every single day as the suppliers are able to provide more doses for shipments, so you can get a real-time view on what's been shipped and what will. And then on the right-hand side, this is the Gavi COVAX facility link, which shows you actual deliveries of a lot of pictures and updates on some of the experience. The last thing I'd like to just say a few words about are some of the challenges and risks that we're facing now in sustaining as well as scaling up the COVAX rollout. And these are very real risks. I'm only going to focus on a few as of the 11th of March, actually, as of today. So we face risks at both the manufacturer level and at the level of countries. At the manufacturer level, first our key supplier, the Serum Institute of India, the big challenge is sustaining the volumes. We have contracted substantial volumes in the tens of millions of doses, as the Director General said, right through. It's a challenge to maintain those volumes, and it's becoming an even greater challenge as more and more government of India and COVAX. So many of these other demands on this is part of our COVAX countries. The primary challenge there is simply the packaging and shipping capacity. Now, in terms of the actual shipments, that's not a problem. It's well managed by PAHO and UNICEF. The problem is getting the doses actually packed, labeled, and to the planes. And AstraZeneca is still having a real challenge keeping up with the speed at which we're trying to move. And then finally, we have had progress with Pfizer now in rolling out the product, still a lot slower than people would like, and still some challenges around the indemnification liability and shipping capacity. Pfizer shipped their own vaccines rather than through UNICEF or PAHO, and as a result, it is a slower rollout because of capacity constraints. The second set of risks that we face are challenges, especially as we, if I could have the next clip, please, on the slide. Yeah, is at the country level. At this point, there is a path forward for almost every country and area in the world to be vaccinating against COVID-19 by the end of March, if the manufacturers can keep up with the pace of rollout and the countries continue to put in place the necessary pieces. But we have to say member states and non-member state countries and entities have done an absolutely extraordinary job in preparing for the arrival of COVAX. Been done, the no-fault compensation. The challenge now is primarily getting vaccines into COVAX that we can ship. We do have a few challenges left at the country level. You can see at the bottom there that 13 of our 190 participants haven't, of the few that have not
Just to inform you that WHO is finalizing the fourth vaccine. As you know, we have approved 3 before, so this will be a fourth vaccine manufactured by J&J, which is part of the COVAX facility portfolio. And the EUL will be published tomorrow, but I wanted to give you a heads up because it increased the number of manufacturers that will provide vaccines to the COVAX facility, and hope will address some of the shortages that we have, the shortages that Bruce was and we also expect other vaccines in the pipeline will also be listed by WHO in the next few weeks. So having additional vaccines will be really crucial. Then one of the challenges, I think, Bruce has said it, maybe to give